Hey everyone, bonjour tout le monde. This is going to be in English. Ceci sera en anglais au départ, mais à la fin, il y aura une vidéo en français. So I'm gonna keep talking in English, and I'm here today and for a few more episodes with Tommo Littlewood, Kate Littlewood. Hey man.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. How is it going?
Not too bad. In nice, cold, wet England, which I haven't been in for some time, so I'm enjoying that. Sure. I'll try and say as much as I can about it. I can be wrong about some things, so please, if anybody disagrees, it's always worth discussing. Generally, cortisol is obviously produced by the adrenal glands. Everyone understands that well-known stress response mechanism, and people often talk about the concept of adrenal fatigue or adrenal upregulation or excess cortisol. And I think a lot of the problems tend to stem is that not a lot of people really kind of appreciate the fact that the adrenal glands are actually thyroid dependent. So the thyroid can have a huge impact on the upregulation of the adrenals as a compensatory mechanism. But the basic biology of it is that cortisol is produced in the adrenal glands, in the adrenal cortex, in an area called the zona, I think it's the zona fasciculata, if I remember rightly. But usually this is activated from a stress response. Particularly sometimes it doesn't always have to go via the central nervous system in the brain, for example. So, but an upregulation can come from the hypothalamus initially, where we produce something called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. That will tend to stimulate the pituitary to produce, it would be CRH, cortical releasing hormone, will stimulate the pituitary to produce ACTH, which is our adrenocorticotropic hormone. And that will have an effect on stimulating cortisol production at the adrenals themselves. Now, that tends to be activated. People classically think about stress as this fight or flight response, this sympathetic upregulation versus parasympathetic suppression, and that's a useful way to think of it, but there are sort of more complexities to it than that. Cortisol tends to be typically released as part of that stress response to basically mobilize fatty acids. They can be mobilized from the liver, from adipose tissue, to respond to the threat of increased stress. Basically, we need to mobilize energy sources, and so when this activation is kind of chronic, we tend to have problems. The diet can have a huge effect on this, because we can think about diet as being a pertinent stressor. So for a lot of people, even not eating regularly, perhaps they're over exercising, perhaps they're under a lot of stress, perhaps they're under they're not eating enough to support what their stress is putting them under, whether it's the emotional stress, whether it's a stress of a mother looking after the children or father looking after the children all day long, or perhaps it's a very physical job, or perhaps it's not a physical job, but it's a very stressful job. Even not eating to support how blood sugar levels should be maintained can have an effect by increasing cortisol, because what the body doesn't want to do is go into a low blood sugar state. Usually there should be enough glucose or glycogen at the liver, but when this is not circulating within the blood supply, then the body doesn't like having low energy supplies. So it will typically liberate cortisol, and it might be the production of the hypothalamus and then the pituitary to stimulate that. And that's where we see these increases in cortisol. So if you don't eat enough, you will start to produce plenty of cortisol. If your body's inflamed, your body will produce glucocorticoids and cortisol anyway, because cortisol is an anti-inflammatory hormone as well. It's important to stress that cortisol isn't necessarily bad, but to the extent it's constantly being expressed is part of the problem of why we can see issues with cortisol, because these have a substantial effect on suppressing organized physiology. So, for example, if you're going in and out of these low blood sugar states, you tend to stimulate cortisol. The activation of the pituitary, for example, is a particular stressor. And cortisol and glucocorticoids generally suppress thyroid physiology anyway. Now, if we start looking at the pituitary, a lot of people look at the pituitary as the master gland, but I tend to see it, and not just me, I'm not that great a thinker, I'm talking about people before me that have suggested that when you activate the pituitary response, you're already kind of activating some kind of stress response that's suboptimal. So we can talk about the interactions between cortisol and thyroid as as a useful indicator. So when people are constantly hungry and stressed out, let's talk about an end range like, say, anorexia or starvation. The constant suppression of thyroid hormone by activation of the pituitary response, producing more cortisol, liberation of fatty acids. To break down fatty acids also requires more cortisol. It's not like when you have adequate carbohydrate available. The net effect of oxidizing carbohydrates is that you produce more carbon dioxide, which helps to regulate the aerobic system more efficiently. So that tends to be suppressed because chronic activation of fatty acids and beta oxidation of fatty acids has a net effect of being stressful, because you need more. Usually you activate the adrenal and the not just cortisol, but the adrenaline response. And generally gluconeogenesis, which is the product of liberating energy from fats and potentially proteins as well, requires the activation of adrenaline and cortisol, and also the hormone glucagon, which I think we're going to talk about as well as part of that process. And so there tend to be aspects of suppression from increasing this chronic maintenance of cortisol production. It can have an effect on, as I said, thyroid physiology at large. And so to the extent that you're chronically stressed, will suppress thyroid hormone, which means it will have an effect on not just metabolism, blood sugar regulation, mood, energy, sleep, digestion, fertility. And that's to the extent why people who undereat, for example, or chronically stressed, tend to exhibit these kind of low energy states that can often be masked by this acute suppression by cortisol, because it's a bit like analogous to runner's high. If you're kind of pushing your body hard and hard, you feel you liberate, you start to produce more adrenaline, start to produce more cortisol, and that can have an effect that's quite euphoric to some. And that's why a lot of people say, I feel great when I'm fasting, or yeah, all this long bouts of exercise, I need that so I can feel better. Well, I think that's where people tend to get lost on what is optimal biology with kind of organized, coherent responses to the stress physiology, where our body makes us feel like that, so that in order that we can liberate energy from fats and proteins. But that can be pretty problematic to people over time, least of all because of the thyroid, when that's suppressed, you tend to lose organization of most tissues, because thyroid hormone permeates every level aspect of biology. And that includes the pituitary responses, that includes the adrenal activation to produce more cortisol. So, I mean, that's generally how I tend to interpret cortisol. It's not necessarily bad, but to the extent that you're constantly liberating energy via perhaps what we could call a stress response pathway. I just want to clarify that a little bit, because there's a lot of contention within, I would say it's more in the health and fitness circles than anywhere, and the dieting circles and nutrition circles. And you see a lot of dogmatic belief that say that carbohydrates aren't essential, and that you can always liberate, you can create more glucose by using fats and proteins as a fuel. But it tends to ignore the very essence of organization and optimal physiology. And we bring it back to, carbohydrates do allow more carbon dioxide production. When there's adequate carbon dioxide around, the system self-regulates much more efficiently. You're able to utilize oxygen. When there's carbon dioxide more available, you stimulate the Bohr effect. That means oxygen disassociates from hemoglobin more efficiently, and therefore the oxidative metabolism is maintained. To the extent that you're kind of, pushing for using fats and proteins as a fuel all the time, does have a secondary effect over time. A lot of people don't tend to notice that until, more of a chronic issue. And, they're very pleased with how they feel with losing some weight that some people tend to get with going low carb over a short time. But to the extent that people say that using that carbohydrates are not essential, tends to ignore the fact of, like I said, optimal physiology, because you tend to need more cortisol to utilize the breakdown of fats and proteins as a fuel. Whereas carbohydrates and being able to flex between fatty acid oxidation, carbohydrate oxidation, somewhere in between, is essentially the hallmark of an optimal and efficient metabolism. But to the extent that you're constantly trying to increase the amount of fatty acids that are being oxidized, needing more cortisol, this can be problematic over time.
And I think we have a good idea of what cortisol can can do, why it's useful, and why it can be problematic in the long term, and why also the way you eat has a direct impact on cortisol secretion, which is not something people talking about chrononutrition. I don't know if you heard about this, like you shouldn't eat carbs in the morning because, you know, your insulin sensitivity is not really good, and it's because of cortisol. If you can change the amount of cortisol you are secreting, obviously you shouldn't consider only the timing of the day, but also what you eat. That was just something more.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much wrapped up in that. I mean, just like the statement that you shouldn't eat carbs in the morning because of cortisol, because if you eat adequate amount of carbs, you can actually lower cortisol. Carbohydrate will lower cortisol. The reason why cortisol tends to elevate, and it's kind of wrapped up in the sleep-wake cycle, you'll generally start to see cortisol, when it goes through that diurnal phase, it starts to elevate, you know, just past when you've gone to sleep. So you start to see a general increase just after midnight, coming up to, say, 2 a.m. And if you think about that, if the last meal you've had is at 7 or 8 p.m., I mean, some people have it much earlier, then you will go through the glucose stores that are available, right? That's in the blood. You'll start to deplete glycogen stored at the liver. Now, bearing in mind, the brain preferentially oxidizes glucose. Why? Because the brain has very sensitive structures, and if it was to chronically oxidize lipids all the time and fatty acids, the amount of lipid peroxidation could damage the very sensitive structures within the brains, the neurons and astrocytes and everything else. So what the brain will probably do, what it does, there's a mechanism to prevent the waste or the utilization of all the glycogen within the liver, sparing it so the brain can use that. Now, to the extent that your body can manage its glucose levels in the night will usually dictate on whether you can sleep efficiently. So the hallmark of people waking up, amongst other things, like we're going to talk about why serotonin and histamine have an effect on the waking state as well. But to the extent that many people can't maintain deep sleep because they can't regulate their blood sugars efficiently. So if your liver's a bit sluggish, through whatever reason, if it has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, perhaps there are other things, perhaps you're in a high polluted area, it burns the liver, and many other things, low thyroid, high estrogen, all of these can have an effect on the liver themselves. But to the extent that you can't maintain deep sleep, because remember that the sleeping brain, the rapid eye phase of movement, uses just as much glucose in the deep phase of sleep as it does in the waking state, mean that you will have to produce a little bit of adrenaline, a little bit of cortisol to liberate energy. And that's a fair reflection for a lot of people that can't maintain their blood glucose levels to sustain sleep overnight. And that's why having something sweet and salty before bed, you can lower cortisol and lower adrenaline. And that's what salt does, it lowers adrenaline, and that's what sugar does, it lowers cortisol. Now, a lot of people tend to get mixed up on that and say, oh, he's telling everyone to eat loads of sugar before bed. No, it's having something sweet and salty, perhaps within a mix of carbohydrates and proteins, if you cannot maintain deep sleep or you have a hard time getting to sleep. Because most people won't be able to get to sleep because their adrenaline is high, their cortisol is high. The neurotransmitters of wakefulness, which we'll talk about, serotonin and histamine, they're not hormones, but they are neurotransmitters which keep you awake. They're not neurotransmitters to get to sleep, and that the role of serotonin, I'm digressing slightly, is much more related to the waking state than it is the sleeping state. But people get mixed up on melatonin. But nobody ever really still talks about, and anybody who's studied any basic tenets of sleep biology understands that, adenosine, GABA, and suppressing things like adrenaline and cortisol and serotonin and histamine are the reasons why you can get to sleep. And the ability to maintain sleep is keeping these hormones, particularly cortisol as well. Imagine you're producing lots of adrenaline and cortisol. There's no wonder why you can't get to sleep. And at the same time, I think you were talking about, why people might go back to fasting. And I see in a lot of clients, a lot of people don't like eating because it makes them feel better. But that's because there's perhaps plenty of digestive irritation. They can't regulate their blood sugar efficiently, and they would rather starve themselves to feel better and controlled. It's about just trying to keep your physiology within this marker here because it feels good, but your physiology wants to be out here. and it wants to be able to kind of expand and contract with the stresses that you deal with. But everyone's so wanting to keep like this because it feels better to feel that way. And I can understand why people do feel like that, but that doesn't mean it's optimal. And to the extent that you're not sleeping, you're ratty with everybody, you kind of hormone irregularities, whether it's low testosterone or, you know, menstrual cycle irregularities, any of these things, digestion, sleep, will dictate whether it's working for you. And so a lot of people will fast. And I don't think there's anything, I used to be quite anti-fasting. And I think fasting made sense from an evolutionary perspective when there wasn't much food around. But I think there are several nuances that you need to consider now. Is one, if you can fast and respond very, very well from it, who am I to argue with that? However, if you're fasting, but you still get all these negative symptoms, then it's probably not working for you. And this is why you see, say, during Ramadan, for example, why people aren't allowed if you're a child or a pregnant woman or you're on medication, because fasting can make any of those conditions worse. Particularly if we talk about, it's obvious why pregnancy and if you're growing, but if you're on a medication, you usually lack metabolic flexibility. And therefore fasting can induce more flex and metabolic inflexibility, particularly if you're liberating fats, needing cortisol, needing adrenaline to use these fatty acids as a fuel. Using those requires many other, requires a need for other nutrients. So when you start to utilize fats as a fuel, you often need more vitamin E available. A lot of people aren't supplementing with vitamin E, for example. That means the lipid peroxides from breaking down the fatty acids will go some way to disturbing aerobic physiology further. And that's where a lot of people's problems start to occur. The ability to use fats and carbohydrates as a fuel efficiently using the aerobic system is disturbed. And that's why fasting can actually send people totally the opposite way to where they want to be. And I did a post on Instagram not so long ago where I had so many people contact me afterwards and say, you know, I was trying to sort my hormones out. I was trying to get pregnant. I was trying to lose weight. I was recommended keto or fasting, and it made me worse. My hair started falling out. My menstrual cycle got worse. I'm insulin resistant now. And, you know, you do see some of these great things from people who talk about keto or fasting. And there are many nuances. First of all, how old is that person? How metabolically flexible they are? Whether they've actually tried any nutritional interventions themselves. I saw somebody who I haven't seen for ages who posted something. He must have lost about 10 stone doing low carb diet. But I know for a fact he's never tried any dietary interventions before. So you would expect that, primarily because there's a calorie deficit as well. When you tend to eat a bit more fat and protein, you tend to feel slightly more satiated in some cases. So there are many contexts to why this can work for people and whether it's going to work. But then also taking that example of that friend there, what's the knock-on effect of his physiology chronically after that? He's been breaking down fats as a fuel. What has he done to his aerobic capacity to be able to burn fats and carbohydrates as a fuel? And adding on to that, you often see so many people who've been on a keto or low carb diet, and as soon as they try to bring carbs back in, they're gaining weight, they feel sleepy. They keep blaming the carbs still, not understanding that the chronic suppression of the glucose-stimulated effect of insulin secretion on the pancreas is diminished substantially. And that's why you see in some keto diets, people induce hypothyroidism, because the stress of liberating energy from using cortisol and fatty acids can have this suppressive effect on thyroid hormone that suppresses TSH production, the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is again is another part of that pituitary stress response that's suppressed by cortisol. So I think there's many contexts and nuances to whether somebody should or shouldn't. And it's not always necessarily related to how much weight someone can lose, because that when we just look at that superficially, that looks great, but you know, it doesn't mean necessarily they're getting the markers back of digestion, sleep, mood, health. And that's why somebody says, yeah, it was great to start off with, and now I've noticed all these other things creep back in. So I think, you know, understanding how cortisol plays into that is quite important.
Is there another hormone that has an anti-inflammatory effect, but that is not in this sort of anti-organization pattern, but more in the other side? Can you think about another hormone?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue things like progesterone acts as an anti-inflammatory hormone.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's obviously in the same pathway as cortisol,
mm-hmm.
within the adrenal pathway. because the adrenals can produce progesterone as well. But you could also argue that thyroid is an anti-inflammatory hormone, not classically, but if you think it has the capacity to restore aerobic metabolism in all its complexes from 1 through to 5, particularly at the end, it restores the ability to utilize carbohydrates in the oxidative pathway and therefore can restore carbon dioxide production. Okay. So to the extent that you can maintain optimal aerobic physiology and not head towards perpetual use of glycolysis, where we get production of ammonia and lactic acid, which can have a degradation effect on biology and therefore increase the amount of inflammation that's going on. But there are also many nutrients, for example, that you could say act like hormones and anti-inflammatory. You know, glycine would be one. You know, vitamin C, for example. You know, we can consume many anti-inflammatory effects on a daily basis that will diminish the impact of these kind of pro-inflammatory states and you know, mimic the anti-inflammatory effects of cortisol without upregulating the stress response pathway and needing for cortisol, for example. Okay. Even you could argue carbon dioxide does the same thing as well.
Okay, excellent. Well, that was pretty much the idea I had in mind. So
I think there's one more interesting point to add, sure, which is that in a normal healthy body, cortisol secretion tends to mimic TSH secretion. So as the thyroid peripheral conversion from T4 to T3 tends to fail, whatever mechanism that might be reduced receptor expression, it might be lack of selenium, it might be, you know, something that blocks thyroid conversion, and ultimately perhaps the deiodinase enzymes are a factor in that as well. Well, they are for sure. But what tends to happen is that people tend to think of as TSH rises, as the lack of thyroid hormone is not efficient, cortisol will tend to rise with that. Well, why? Because we know that when thyroid's not optimal, we tend to go into a pro-inflammatory state. But the problem is that to the extent that excess cortisol and the glucocorticoids are being produced, will suppress TSH. So a lot of people think that you should see high cortisol with high TSH, but if your cortisol is rampant and all the other stress mechanisms are rampant and the oxidative pathways are diminished because you're constantly burning fats as a fuel and your body can't handle it, then the TSH can appear completely normal. So you would expect cortisol to rise in essence with the elevation of TSH, but that's not set in stone. But there are several papers that suggest that. So you can see TSH being suppressed and very, very low, primarily just because the stress response tied in with the pituitary that's suppressing TSH, but also allowing the pituitary production of adrenocorticotropic hormone and the production of cortisol can actually suppress that response as well. And again, I think there are many different things that tie into that kind of stress physiology versus organized physiology that need to be considered that I don't think are a lot of the time.